What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, which is a bit of a mouthful, but this game is ultimately a spin-off from the Yakuza series, of course, and specifically a spin-off from Infinite Wealth, this time featuring Goro Majima, however. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Like a Dragon here, there are actually a few other important notes I need to mention. Just a couple days ago, actually, I did do a sponsored video for this game, mostly because I was looking to play this game as a bit of a break from my regular sort of heavy RPGs, and it seemed pretty fun. So while this review is not sponsored, and no review I do ever will be, I have done a sponsored video for this game previously. What's more though, actually surprisingly, a very easy 100%. The Yakuza games have a, I would say, reputation for being somewhat tedious 100%, but this one not so much. Knocked out the entire thing in about 35 hours, like 36 if you want to get specific. And while the achievements, I would say, only cover roughly 85-ish% of what the game actually has to offer, it's definitely on the shorter side overall. But let's actually get into what this game is all about. So obviously, as already mentioned, spin-off from Infinite Wealth, this time putting us in the role of Goro Majima, who has, since the events of Infinite Wealth, lost his memory only to find himself washed ashore, where he has to quickly get to grips with not only himself, but also everything going on around him. Specifically, the somewhat thriving pirate culture happening around the islands of Hawaii. In doing this, we ultimately land ourselves on a pirate ship, where we're going to be fighting off other ships, exploring islands full of treasure, and even tracking down familiar locations and people from the original Infinite Wealth. And like most Yakuza games, the bizarre mini-games that are, I would say, fever dream-esque have made a return, including an insanely long side quest that has a whole bunch of like live-action videos in regards to like this dating thing you set up. It's a whole bit of nonsense. And yet, in spite of that, the story manages to remain impactful. I think the ending went especially hard because with the loss of your memory, you have to sort of find new reasons to be who you are, and I think the story does a good job of chasing some of that down. And yet, in spite of that, there are still a few weak things I want to point out. I honestly think the ship combat itself could be a little more robust. They did the cosmetic part of it really well, but the actual ship combat tends to be a little one note, and much like Infinite Wealth itself, it has an extremely slow start. It takes a couple hours for it to really get going. But before we dive into all that, let's first talk about the technical state of this one. So, I didn't know where else to put this, so I did want to throw this in here somewhere. However, if you're on the fence about this game, there is actually a publicly available demo that you can try before you buy, which I think is important because of the switch up in combat mechanics and stuff that happened from Infinite Wealth to this game. So while this type of combat isn't unique in terms of the overall series, they've done games like this in the past. I just wanted to throw it out here that if you don't know how you'll feel about it because you've, say, only played the turn-based Like a Dragon entries, you can try this out for yourself. But otherwise, in terms of actual technical problems, I really didn't have much in the way of issues, but when I first started playing the game, I had one that was not exactly small. Initially, the game wouldn't launch for me at all, and after doing a bit of troubleshooting, this turned out to be a driver issue of some sort, and I say some sort because I'm not exactly sure what the problem was. I ultimately just had to uninstall and reinstall my driver, and for whatever reason, that seemed to fix the issue for me. Once that was done, honestly, smooth sailing, pun intended. Didn't have a single issue besides. Now, a quick browse through Steam user reviews, however, will point out that some people have been experiencing problems with things like crashing, etc., so I wouldn't say it's completely out of the realm of possibility, mind you. And given my problem with that driver, you may start there if you have issues yourself and want to do some troubleshooting. Moving on, though, let's talk about difficulty and New Game Plus. So, this game, with its beat-em-up style combat, does come with a few different difficulties. Beginner, standard, and professional. Pretty much does what you'd expect. Enemies hit a lot harder, have more or less health, that kind of thing. This game isn't so difficult that I, would say professional is like impossible or anything like that. In fact, if anything, I found normal mode to be maybe a little too easy, and that's coming from somebody who doesn't necessarily play these kinds of games all the time. But nonetheless, if you're having trouble with it, there are actually difficulty options you can adjust, and we'll get into combat a little more later. Beyond that, I did want to especially point out that this game does in fact have New Game Plus. Right now, it is free with the base game, which unfortunately unfortunately bears a mention because Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth tied New Game Plus to a DLC. I was not a fan of that decision, made a whole video about how not only was it a poor practice, but the actual content of the DLC they attached it to sucked. So I'm happy to see that they have corrected that misstep here, but I'm hardly going to heap praise on them for having done so. Now, after you finish the game, obviously you can go into New Game Plus, but you can also continue playing in what they call Premium Adventure. Now, this game lets you change outfits and stuff right away, so you can customize how your character looks basically all the time. And in the previous games, my understanding is that's what you could do in Premium Adventure. So really the only purpose for it here is just to let you finish up doing like the side quests and anything you might have missed to wrap up, say, the 100%. And then if you want to run through the game again fully powered up, you can do so. But from there, let's talk story setup and my thoughts on it. So as I mentioned, Majima washes up on the beaches of an island known as Rich Island, where he encounters a young boy named Noah. Noah ultimately helps you get back on your feet in the wake of your memory loss, and the two of you wind up becoming pirates, and you rope in a whole bunch of other people along this adventure, including Noah's father, and many returning characters from both Infinite Wealth, but also the series as a whole. In so doing, however, alongside just trying to piece our life back together in the wake of our memory loss, we ultimately come upon the tale of a treasure, specifically the fabled elixir of life, and our goal is to, of course, track that down, doing everything possible to find it. And that's pretty much all I want to say here for the sake of avoiding spoilers, but a couple of notes. One, as I mentioned, the story gets off to a very slow start. Infinite Wealth did this too, but the game spends a couple hours just walking you through incredibly basic stuff, with a nonsense amount of dialogue to go with it, and it definitely feels like, you could wrap this up. We don't need to do this, I don't think. Nothing about this game is so complicated as to warrant like a 4 to 5 hour intro. But in spite of that, it does eventually get quite good. I think they used his memory loss in particular to sort of drive home finding reasons to go on, reasons to continue living. And given how Infinite Wealth ended, which I also don't really want to spoil here either, and how some of the main cast of the Yakuza series wind up, I think that has the potential to be an impactful story for you, in spite of the sort of fever dream-esque tone of the rest of the game, which I thought was always fun to see. If you haven't noticed by now on the channel, I really do enjoy games that can tell you a really serious story while surrounding it with some honestly kind of nonsense game mechanics. So yes, the game is very silly, but it has a message if you're willing to hear it. And that brings us to the progression systems of the game. So progression in this game basically comes down to Majima and the ship itself, which are two separate bits of progression, but ultimately use the same resources: pirate points and your own just cold hard cash. So first up, we have our pirate rank. As we do various activities, complete challenges, quests, etc., we'll gain points. These points can ultimately lead to us ranking up as a pirate. There are 5 ranks. You're going to hit the last rank way before you run out of points. If anything, I think they could have stretched that out more. But as you gain pirate ranks, you gain access to all sorts of other progressions, such as abilities that you can buy for Majima to help him out in the beat-em-up combat, the ability to recruit more people for your ship who won't join you otherwise, and just a whole host of other things. There are even some side quests they won't let you do before this. But once you've got the points and the money, Majima can spend some of that stuff upgrading his abilities for his various combat styles and his overall stats. These are a little bit front-loaded, but don't neglect learning new combos for the two different combat styles, which is going to open up some honestly fantastic moves and finishers for you that can make combat very easy. But then we have the ship itself and everything that goes with it. So first we have to get that ship, and then we have to get to a point in the story where we can upgrade that ship so it can be properly outfitted. At this point, you'll be able to customize both the appearance of it, but also its sort of functional layout in terms of the cannons you're using, the machine guns at play, the rocket launcher you can use in combat, and there's a few different options here. I will say ship combat is not varied enough for this to really be impactful a lot of the times. Basically, if you just upgrade to the best stuff and have a good crew, you'll be good to go. But you can craft some cannons, just buy others outright, and getting that upgraded is part of the game's progression. But another huge part of ship progression is actually your crew. So you'll go around actually recruiting members to join the Goro pirates on your ship, the Goro Maru. This can be done by just talking to some people, other times you have to complete a quest, sometimes that stuff is a little more involved, etc. But basically, befriend people and they'll usually join your crew. Then you can assign them to various jobs on the actual ship itself. It's important to pay attention to the stats of each individual character because you can assign a first mate, which will give you an ability. You can assign some characters to a support squad, which will give you bonuses in deck battles, which we'll get to. You can assign squad leaders, which will then, of course, buff up the squad they are assigned to. So the layout of this crew and how you're using them on your ship also matters. And you do actually have to keep them happy via morale, but it's pretty easy to do. You can basically just throw a party every once in a while and be good to go. And that brings us to the gameplay and world section. So this is pretty much split, as you might imagine, between a whole bunch of islands and then the open ocean itself. There are 4 primary islands and then a whole host of smaller treasure islands and then a few areas you'll go to just for the story. The 4 main islands are Rich Island, your sort of home base, though honestly I didn't wind up going there much because the ship itself acts as your home base a lot of the time. The returning large explorable area of Honolulu, where we'll meet all sorts of characters old and new. Nele Island, which was part of the story from the first game as well, and then Madlantis. Madlantis is a sort of pirate den where you can get up to all sorts of activities such as the Pirate Coliseum and do a little more exploration. Now, in between each of those islands will often be sailing the sea. This is done largely by traveling through the sort of windy corridors that make you travel faster, but you can also get into fights with other ships along the way and discover islands that can be plundered for treasure, of course. Treasures are a great way of getting both money and actual pirate rank, which is how you're going to upgrade all your abilities and stuff like I mentioned earlier. Some of these treasures, however, have other benefits, such as being usable in combat, like a pistol, or later on you get a chain hook. You can get dark instruments that can effectively summon in things to help you in combat, or equipable rings. I didn't mention the rings much in the progression section, so you have 10 ring slots, one for each finger of course, and certain rings can only be assigned to certain fingers, but basically these will increase your stats but also give you certain benefits as well. Sometimes just powering up various moves you can do, making exploration a little easier in some cases. None of them are potentially make or break, but just equip the best ones as you find them. They're relatively linear in terms of progression and honing in on the type of gameplay you want to actually take part in. But the thing is, one of them at the very end is incredibly overpowered. Once you've cleared out the entire Pirates Coliseum, which is one of the main minigames where we can take place in basically arena battles involving both ship and melee combat, you'll eventually have the chance to fight what amounts to a super boss. And once you beat that super boss, you'll gain the Champion's Ring, and this is basically an I win button for combat. It's nonsense and definitely bears a mention for sure. But outside of those sort of main themes that we'll be up to, there's a whole host of other stuff to do while you're exploring as well. For instance, you can get like a whole little mini zoo working on Rich Island where you can sort of find and rescue animals and then feed them and take care of them back on Rich Island, and they can even join your crew after that. There's bounties to track down for cold hard cash. There's pirate crew members to be found and recruited. But then, of course, the mini-games. So we see the return of a lot of mini-games, also a few new ones that weren't in Infinite Wealth, such as Bang Bang Bat, I think it's called, something like that. Basically, you shoot cannonballs at barrels to get as high of a score as possible. And then for some reason, Crazy Delivery has always spoke to me personally, which is a game where you deliver food while doing tricks on a bike. But, even some of the even more bizarre stuff, like Sicko Snap comes back, which is a really funny one. And there's a whole host of others that you don't have to engage with. There's even a kart racer. And so between that and the sort of fast-paced, more action-oriented nature of this game, I would say a lot of this game really is just about having as much of a good time as you can and sort of living it up with the time you've got, which somewhat surprisingly, inadvertently comes back around to reinforcing what the game's main story and side quests are all about, which is, I would say simply put, that life is for living, and finding reasons to live and go farther and set up the next generation to do the same. And even some of the really funny side quests can often be associated with themes like that, which I think is the mark of something that's well done and really fun. So I mentioned earlier that there's a very long side quest that involves like a live-action dating sequence. Basically, we're trying to help a main crew member find the love of his life, so we set him up on a whole bunch of dates, and they go very poorly, but ultimately what he learns from that is to take accountability for himself and learn and grow from it. So it again wound up being this really just hilariously funny thing to watch and be involved in, only to then, hit you with some actual meaningful self-reflection at the end of it, and I think that was a lot of fun for me personally at least. But we even see that with, for instance, a side quest that is basically a Dragon Ball Z knockoff, where an old man requests that you go around finding 7 golden balls only to realize at the end of it he's got to get his life together and stop doing this. So simply put, Gameplay, exploration, all that stuff. Is it anything revolutionary? No, but it is bizarre, it's a lot of fun, and there's some meaning there if you look for it. So from there, let's talk about combat now. So combat can also be divided up into ground and ship combat. Ground combat itself can be divided up a little farther into our two combat styles, as well as combos and stuff. So your effectiveness in combat is basically going to come down to the rings you've got equipped alongside your upgrades that you've made to those combo styles and, just everything you can do stats-wise. Honestly, it's not a particularly hard thing to get to grips with. It's basically a standard, kind of combo beat 'em up, but still a few things to know. Our combat styles are Mad Dog and Sea Dog. Mad Dog is best for like one-on-one fights usually, and Sea Dog is better for multiple opponents. That's not always the case, but generally that's how it works. Now, in Mad Dog, we can, of course, light and heavy attack, string together combos with just punches and or knives, and do a better job of blocking from a singular direction, which is going to allow you to set up counters and stuff and potentially even stun the enemy by like knocking them down and whatnot. Then we have Sea Dog. Sea Dog, as I mentioned, all about AoEs, but as the game progresses, you actually wind up getting tools to use in this style as well, such as the pistol or the chain hook. The chain hook is going to allow you to both traverse the actual world, but you can also use it in combat to grapple enemies, and in fact, one of the better combos you get comes immediately after doing a chain hook on an enemy in combat, which will then lead you to your heat actions. Heat actions are performed by filling up the heat meter, the blue bar under your health, and when it's full, you can activate whatever the requirement is to perform some combo that will go into a little cutscene and deal a whole bunch of damage. This heat bar is actually why that champion's ring I mentioned earlier is so overpowered once you finally get it, but the game is probably over at that point, so it's fine. That ring says it gradually refills this bar, but it actually refills it very, very fast, meaning that you can effectively chain these heat actions together as quickly as you please, meaning that you effectively become unbeatable. But when using our heat actions, we ultimately fill up, I think it's called the madness gauge, I never quite caught the name of it, but when we use our heat gauge, it fills up very quickly our other gauge, which is dependent on the type of combat style we are currently in. In Mad Dog style, what this gauge will do is summon clones of Goro Majima, which can be incredibly deadly just for single target damage, because all of them will attack the same character and you can just quickly burn a character down. Now in Sea Dog style, when we activate that, it actually gives us the opportunity, once we acquire them, to summon in the Dark Gods. Basically, we play a cursed instrument to summon in help. This can be everything from a monkey going crazy, sharks attacking everything, so on and so forth. Generally speaking, these could be either really, really helpful, or if you use the wrong one, not helpful at all. Depends on the situation, really. But your goal generally is to handle all of that while facing huge numbers of enemies. Now, sometimes during ship combat, you take part in what is called a deck battle, or sometimes when you're exploring treasure islands, you have to fight whole hosts of enemies at once. These typically involve some amount of your crew helping you in combat to offset the numbers. Deck battles, in particular, are interesting because your crew is going to use things like squad leader and support leader traits to buff up their numbers, while trying to help you take out the enemy crew and captains and stuff. So it's just like your pirate crew versus their pirate crew. And while you can be pretty strong, the chances of you taking out the entire enemy ship by yourself are pretty low thanks to these other modifiers that will allow them to deal more damage and just honestly stunlock you to death if nothing else, which is something you have to look out for in combat. Sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed just through sheer numbers because of the numbers of people that are fighting on screen sometimes. But from there, let's talk specifically about ship combat. So, as I mentioned, not as in-depth as I would like it to be, but it still has a few things worth talking about. We've got our frontal machine guns. They come in a few varieties, but basically pretty much what you'd expect. You can shoot enemy ships in front of you. On our port and starboard sides, we have our cannons, of course. Cannons come in a few different types as well. They can be things like flamethrowers, traditional cannons, energy lasers that are sustained over time, just as an example. Machine guns can be fired almost perpetually. They do technically only fire for a set amount of time, but the cooldown is almost instantaneous, so you can just refire them again afterwards. But your cannons will actually go into a cooldown after having been used, and then you have to wait a little bit. It's also possible to ram enemy ships with your boost, which can both be used in and out of combat. This effectively makes your ship move faster, allowing you to drift and perform maneuvers if need be. So there's that. Typically, your crew does all of that for you while you are sailing the ship, but if you press the switch to deck mode, you can actually get on the deck of your own ship and do some of this. Sometimes that's important for helping your crew members get back on their feet. Say if they got hit by cannon fire, you will actually have to sort of res them, but you're a sitting duck while you do this, so you can activate a smoke screen to dissuade enemies from actually hitting you while you go around and do what you need to do, which is also a good time to bust out the rocket launcher, which will of course be able to be fired at ships. And while it's not always the most impactful damage-wise, certain rocket launchers do have sort of side effects that you can use, like setting enemy ships on fire or perhaps even freezing them, things like that can make them a little more useful, but I found those to be pretty situational. So ultimately what most ship combat winds up coming down to, once you've upgraded your ship and you've got like, the best equipment and you've got the stats maxed out with your money and whatnot, you basically just rock up, fire the machine guns, occasionally ram a ship, fire the cannons, and most everything dies around you very, very quickly once you've gotten the hang of it. And it never kind of really evolves from that standpoint, so it can get a little stale after a while, which I would say is probably one of the reasons for the shorter runtime here. All of that, though, does bring us to the Steam Deck section of this review, and while the game itself does say the Steam Deck is in fact verified, much like Infinite Wealth, I would say it runs okay. But places like the explorable area of Honolulu and just faster-paced fights and stuff, it seems to struggle with FPS here and there. And then I also noticed people talking about a lot of crashes on the Steam Deck, but I didn't personally have any issues with it. But again, saw some people reporting that. Otherwise, though, perfectly playable. You have your controller support, cloud saves, all the usual stuff. If anything, a lot of people prefer to play this type of game with a controller, so I could see you playing it there. But if you want to play it long term on the Steam Deck, you might have to mess around with the settings to get it to a really stable spot, especially in the larger explorable open zones, as you may have expected. But if you're willing to do that, it should work fine for you on the Steam Deck without too much of a hassle, which does bring us to our positives and negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, I really enjoyed the sort of main story, the nonsense that then leads into I would say more impactful than you might expect ending, the side content, which honestly does a lot of the same stuff, and just the sort of bizarre fun of the overall experience, leading to a sort of fever dream-esque escapade through the seas as a pirate. But that combined with combat that I surprisingly enjoyed. I wasn't sure how I would feel about the sort of beat-em-up style combat. I know a lot of the previous Yakuza games have used this, but I honestly don't really play it much personally, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. The combos and stuff were more fun to pull off than I expected, and going against a fight that was supposed to be super tough and then managing to pull it off without even really breaking a sweat was enjoyable for me, at least, and a nice break from what I often do in other games, which was, good for me at the very least. But we still have those negatives. As I mentioned, basically I just wish the ship combat was a little more robust. I think they nailed the cosmetic side of it. You really can make a ship look and feel however you want, basically, but in terms of combat, it's all pretty much the same, and I think that was a little disappointing. Given that a huge part of this game focuses on the ship combat, I think that's a bit of a bummer, frankly. And then there was the extremely slow start. Again, Infinite Wealth also did this, but it just takes so long to get you through the tutorials and show you where everything is and like talk to this person to do this thing. It's like, all right, man, I get it. Like I don't need you to give me like a 2-hour tutorial about how to use the ship upgrade menu, But ultimately, that brings me to my conclusion. Speaking for myself, Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza was exactly what I was looking for. A sort of lighter, sillier, fun adventure to break up a lot of the heavier RPGs I've been playing here lately. And it did a very good job at that particular thing. So I think if you are looking for a similar experience or just want to play something a little more focused on actually having fun and being a good time, I think it's a great game specifically for that. And what's more, if you're a little unsure about any of it, there is again that demo available. You can play it and check it out for yourself, which is certainly a good thing given that this is a $60 full price game. But I had a blast playing it, so it gets a buy out of me, and it was just the kind of refresher I needed before jumping back into some other stuff. So with that, we're going to call it a review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, and stick around. Let me know down below how you feel about this one. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.